As indicated, my title of my paper is Studying Parliament's Past to Understand its Future. Those of you who've been involved in the PSA Parliaments specialist group will have heard me talk about this paper at some various points in the past, but I hope to be able to offer a bit more than I've been able to talk about previously. The central contention of my paper is that it is both possible and necessary to study Parliament's place in the UK Constitution historically. By this, I mean that we both can and should generate inferences about Parliament's constitutional role in the present and in the future by studying past events. The paper forms part of a book project looking at the role the House of Commons plays when the UK engages in military action abroad. I've penciled it in as a standalone chapter, but it may wind up being more of a sort of theoretical ground-clearing exercise for me, rather than something that actually winds up in the book manuscript. You're going to see exactly how it all plays out. The broader project will involve a series of case studies of moments when the House of Commons appeared to override the government over a matter of military action, including in 1782, Lord North's downfall over the North American War, 1855, Lord Aberdeen's downfall over the Crimean War, 1915, the fall of Asquith's first coalition over shell production in the Dardanelles campaign in the First World War, 1940, Neville Chamberlain's resignation after the Norway debate, 1956, Anthony Eden's resignation after Suez. And I've got a few other possible case studies which I've got question marks over. 1857, Lord Palmerston loses a vote following his ordering of military action in Persia without prior parliamentary approval, calls an election in response and wins. 1895, Lord Rosebery resigns after his government is censured in the defence estimates. And in 2013, something I've written about quite a lot, David Cameron's defeat over military intervention in Syria. I'm also going to try and contextualise these moments by looking a bit more briefly at surrounding episodes when the House of Commons considered military action but didn't actually directly override the government. There were three such moments during the Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars. A number of other smaller moments during the 19th century, including in 1886, the House of Commons rejects a motion demanding a parliamentary veto over major foreign policy commitments. And then 1899, the outbreak of the Boer War, 1950, the outbreak of the Korean War, 1982, the outbreak of the Falklands War, 1991, the outbreak of the Gulf War, and 2003, the invasion of Iraq, all moments when the House of Commons considered military action, but ultimately wound up supporting the government. In the first part of this specific paper, I argue that a historical approach to studying these issues is necessary. Specifically, I argue that we can only understand Parliament's role in times of war by studying past precedents. This is because most of the rules governing how the UK uses force consist of uncodified conventions rather than codified laws, though there are some relevant statutes. Two in particular stand out. Firstly, the convention that the monarch exercises their royal prerogative to direct the armed forces on the advice of ministers, only and always on the advice of ministers. And secondly, the convention that the ministry must retain the confidence of the House of Commons. And there's change during my time period, whether we're talking about the ministry as a whole or whether we're talking about the Prime Minister in particular. I'm probably going to talk a bit less about a third possible convention that has developed since 2003, the proto-convention that MPs should have the chance to veto major overseas military deployments. I've written about this quite a bit, most recently in Parliamentary Affairs just a couple of months ago. So I don't think it's going to be a major part of this project. I'm kind of trying to get away from what I think is a slightly narrow recent debate. So I think the key thing I'm arguing here is that you can't have a convention without precedents. Conventions are made of precedents, reasons, and consensus. So what happened in the past directly affects what conventions can exist today. But you also can't have a convention without a consensus that it is a convention, which in turn depends in part on whether there is consensus about what precedents exist and what they mean. For this reason, I think it is impossible to fully distinguish between historical research of this type and contemporary constitutional debate. And indeed, one of my explicit goals with the project is to try to influence how contemporary parliamentarians understand their own role by offering, I think, a broader and deeper account of what roles their predecessors have played in the past. In the second part of the paper, I move on to argue that a historical approach is possible. Specifically, I argue that it is possible to derive useful insights into the present and future powers of the House of Commons by studying past events. Now, this stance raises a number of serious historiographical questions, which I discuss in the paper, and maybe we can talk about some more in the Q&A. In part, what I'm saying in response is that ultimately, although I'm using historical methods, I am not a historian. I'm a political scientist, and I'm interested in the kinds of questions, general questions and contemporary questions that political scientists are interested in, even if I think that we can understand these questions by looking at the past. I also think that constitutional history, at least in the United Kingdom, belongs in a slightly different category to other parts of history. Given the political nature of the UK constitution and the role of history in the political contestations around it, I think it's actually essential to study history with this kind of mindset in a way that isn't always true for every branch of history. Nevertheless, I propose to take very seriously the advice offered by successive generations of political historians, not to treat the present as the inevitable consequence of the past, not to forget that participants in past events didn't know how they would turn out, and not to underestimate the very real differences in the norms, assumptions, and practices of different time periods, and I'm going to mention some of those in a second. Finally, I'm also very deliberately grounding my case studies in primary archival evidence. I'm very much have enjoyed so far and looking forward over the coming months now to spending much more time surrounded by the smell of 18th century documents, trying to decipher the sometimes completely illegible handwriting of 18th and 19th century ministers and officials. In the final part of the paper, I talk more about the case studies, I introduce the case studies and highlight some of the ways in which I am conscious that Parliament's position in the Constitution, and in particular the House of Commons' position in the Constitution, has and has not changed over time. I think my core argument here is that what Parliament is has not changed. What Parliament is fundamentally as a cog in the constitutional machine has not changed. At its absolute core, Parliament exists to vote supplies so the Crown can wage war. This is why Parliament evolved in the first place. What it demands in return for votes of supply has absolutely developed and become much more extensive over time. And the actual process of voting supply has declined in significance markedly since the late 19th century. But certainly since at least 1689, this broad picture has been stable. And I would argue that this question or this balance or this relationship was central to the two 17th century revolutions as well. At the same time, I'm very conscious that what Parliament does has changed a great deal over the course of my period. Before the Reform Act, the monarch chooses the Prime Minister. And in fact, Lord North's downfall in 1782 is an early example of a Prime Minister being brought down by the House of Commons against the King's wishes. And it's such a dramatic development that George III drafts an abdication statement in response. It's in the Royal Archives in Windsor, saying, right, that's it. If you won't let me have my Prime Minister, if you won't let me have my policy, I'm going back to Hanover. From 1832 onwards, though, the House of Commons chooses the Prime Minister and the monarch only gets to play a marginal role, William IV being the last monarch to try and directly appoint a Prime Minister in 1834, an attempt that proves unsuccessful. Between the Reform Act and the late 19th century emergence of recognisably modern political parties, the Commons really does choose the government. In the period between the two Reform Acts, the first two Reform Acts, most governments fall between rather than at elections, not least because most of them rely on shifting informal coalitions of support in a context in which the Commons contains a large number of independent members. This then has an effect on the role of ministers, because as the survival of ministries comes to depend on ministers' ability to sustain a majority in the Commons, it becomes clear that ministers themselves are going to have to sit in the Commons. And part of the debate in 1855 that brings down the Duke of Aberdeen's, or the Earl of Aberdeen's government, is the fact that the Secretary of State for War, the Duke of Newcastle, is sitting in the Lords, where he is unable to answer the increasingly vociferous criticisms and complaints coming from MPs. And we see over time other great officers of state gradually cease to be held by members of the Lords. Lord Carrington's appointments as first Defence and then Foreign Secretary in the 1970s were considered somewhat anomalous at the time. And he is, I think, a special case, being actually a career politician who just happened to be a hereditary peer. The development of recognisable parties, the reduction of backbench members' control over parliamentary business in the late 19th century, then shifts power again away from members towards parties, towards party leaders and party whips. Meanwhile, we've seen a continued process of power drifting away from the Lords. And I think that focusing on the Commons is justified anyway, because I think that we can see that it's always had precedence in matters of supply, which is the most fundamental issue I'm discussing. But certainly from 1911 onwards, the role of the Lords has been greatly diminished. And finally, I'm conscious of the impact of the gradual opening up of parliamentary debates, first to newspaper reports, the legitimisation of Hansard, then to radio, television, and ultimately social media, which have fundamentally changed both the nature and character of proceedings in the chamber. We see significant increases, for example, in the number of MPs participating in debates on military action. Above all, with this project, I hope to generate greater understanding of the range of powers potentially open to MPs. There's been a lot of focus recently on ex-ante deployment votes, but historically, MPs have used a much wider range of tools: performative debates, inquiries, budgetary measures, confidence votes, legislative log rolling, extra parliamentary campaigns, and deliberate votes to support the government to influence foreign policy. The fact these things have been used in the past generally means they could be used in the present or the future, though this will not uniformly be true. We might see, for example, the resurrection of the humble address procedure in the 2017-19 Parliament. Moreover, some of the fundamental issues at stake, such as the proper balance between executive and legislative power, or the importance of secrecy to effective foreign and security policy, arise repeatedly over time. Sir Bernard Jenkins' speech in the debate on Syria on April 2018 perfectly echoed the constitutional arguments that Lord North made in 1782. So in drawing out this continuity, I believe I can show that this tension between Parliament and the executive is fundamental, unavoidable, and constant over time. And in doing that, I hope to be able to say something more general about the nature of Parliament, the nature of the House of Commons, and the role of these institutions within the wider Constitution over more than 300 years since 1782. Thank you.